All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, or thanks Greg and Ron for joining us tonight. We got a light crowd, but no worries. We're going to record this and we'll send it back out to the membership and post it on the site as well. Tonight we've got Dr. Les Anderson. Dr. Anderson is a reproductive physiologist and the beef cattle extension specialist here at the University of Kentucky. For the last couple of years, Les has been working on estrous synchronization protocols and the yaks that we've been working with to try and artificially inseminate in conjunction with Greg and Morehead State. And so what we thought we would do this evening is share a little bit of information on what Dr. Anderson has learned with regards to controlling reproduction and estrus in yaks. And the reason that's important is it has an effect on when your calves are going to be born. And so with that, Dr. Anderson, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn Cooler and Ron, Greg, welcome. And welcome to everybody that's picking this up on the web and just using it to extend your education. I'm working with the yaks the last year and a half or 2 years, however long it's been a lot of fun, a lot of discovery, and I'm anxious to share some of the information that we have and some of the information that's been published about the yaks. You never really know who's going to be in the audience or who's going to be watching you online. So in general, this is the outline of tonight's talk. I want to talk just a little bit about just general reproduction in yaks, how they cycle, what controls their cycle, what controls them getting pregnant. And we're going to go over some terminology, because terminology is extremely important when you're communicating, terms and trying to set up reproductive management plans. Having the right terminology is actually pretty important. Then we're going to jump into reproductive states. I'm all about taking control of stuff. Dr. Lynn Cooler will attest that I'm not a big fan of the random nature of how we produce animals sometimes in our country. I really think that our profitability and our productivity is dictated quite a bit on our ability and our desire to want to take control of the management of our animals. And I'm going to give you an example of how to do that to wrap up. So I'm just going to start off with just a general discussion on reproductive biology in the yak. One of the first things that you see when you jump in the literature is everybody talks about them being seasonal. And so when a reproductive specialist, a reproductive physiologist hears the term seasonal, we're thinking the pineal gland, we're thinking short day breeders, long day breeders, that kind of stuff that interacts with sheep and with horses and so forth. And just to be honest with you, doesn't seem like to me the pineal gland's got a whole lot to do with the seasonality of yaks. I'm not sure about other parts of the country, but the yaks that we've worked with here in Kentucky seem to be able to cycle year round as long as they're in great shape and as long as they're not pregnant. And so the seasonal nature of the yak is really quite a bit more determined by their environment. You know, the Himalayas, I'm just going to assume for at least 7 to 8 months of the year is a pretty harsh environment. Very limited nutrition, very limited resources for these animals. And the one thing that biology has evolved over time is that almost all animals have the ability in their brain to sense the environment around them and sense the nutrient status of their body and in the environment. And so it really seems like to me that the seasonality of the yak is more related to the harsh conditions and the low body condition and low nutrient availability of the animals for a vast majority of the time. And so they try to catch up when the grass hits and it's starting to get going. The estrous cycle length of the yak is very, very similar to beef cattle. And actually, one of the things that I kind of appreciate about yak reproduction is it's extremely similar to beef cattle. And so it's a book that I've read, right? And so I feel very comfortable talking about about reproduction in yaks because it really is very similar to a book that I've already read. The normal range that you're going to see in yaks in published data is somewhere from 18 to 22 days. But the biggest thing is estrus is not super obvious in yaks. And so sometimes you see quite a range in estrus cycle length, mainly because they're not able to detect behavioral estrus. So the animals seem to be cycling normally. So the ovaries are changing, the structures are changing on the ovaries like normal, but the behavioral expression of estrus is really very limiting in a lot of situations in yaks. When they have caught them in heat, and there's several fairly large experiments where they were doing a really nice job of catching the seasonality of the yaks. It seems like their length of the estrus cycle is about normal. Normal meaning compared to beef cattle. So typically you're going to see that 12 hours, okay, where they're in standing estrus, which is when they will allow another animal to jump on their back. But I have seen actually published data all the way up to 3 days. I think that's probably stretching it a little bit. In our experience there with Greg, I think that's probably stretching it quite a bit. I'd say 24 hours is probably your max in a normally cycling yak. But again, the observation of estrus in yaks is very difficult. One of the things that we're trying to do, Dr. Lemkuhler and I, is we put cow manager tags in some of the cattle here so that we can get a better idea of the actual activity of the animals, particularly when we're not able to be out there watching them. Cow manager is an electronic movement, is a device that senses the movement and the activity of the animals, a pedometer of sorts, and so that we can get a 24-hour real-time observation on their activity. Ovulation appears to occur 10 to 12 hours after the end of heat, very similar to beef cattle. And the 3 published papers I've read, at 24 hours, everything is ovulated. So 24 hours after the end of estrus, not the beginning, but the end of estrus, every animal is ovulated, with the average being somewhere in that 10 to 12 range in most of the research that's been published. Just a few definitions here, and again, pretty important when we're talking about enhancing reproductive efficiency or making these animals a little bit more reproductively efficient. Conception rate and pregnancy rate are 2 terms that are really confused quite often. Conception rate is the percentage of animals that conceive at 1 heat. Okay, so we've got 20 cows. We get them all in heat today. I bred all 20 of them today, and 10 of them got pregnant. Our conception rate is 50%, but that's 1 heat. If we stretch that out over a breeding season, okay, and your breeding season can be 365 days, then that's pregnancy rate. So how many get pregnant or are pregnant at the end of the entire breeding season, okay? So conception rate is a multiple, right? So if you got 70% conception rate now, okay, and so if you breed 100 of them, 70 of them conceive, you got 30 of them come back in heat. If those 30 have a 70% conception rate, then you get 21 more of them in heat. So then you add those 2, 70 and 21, and after 2 heats, you got over 90% of your animals pregnant. And so that's the real difference between conception rate and pregnancy rate. And it's something that we really, it's a term that people get confused with quite a bit, and I like to make sure that everybody's on the same page there. Calving rate, of course, is the percent of cows that calve in a group, and I want you to take that from the group that was exposed to the bull versus the group that's currently still in the pasture. Calving rate and calving percentage is a little difficult in the normal environment for yaks. Almost all the data says that pretty much you're going to get a calf every 1.5 to 2 years in yaks. And again, that is in their normal natural environment. in the Himalayas. And so a lot of that has to do with some of the difficulties they have there in their environment. And I think if we strive to have a little higher calving rate here and perhaps a little more nutrient dense environment, we're certainly going to be able to improve our ability for the animals to generate some profit for us. Weaning rate, of course, then is the percent of cows in a group that actually wean a calf. And that just runs through an example there. Oops, sorry about that. Runs through an example there of conception, pregnancy rate, calving rate, weaning rate, and then a 20% death loss. Sometimes we have fairly high death losses. So what then controls estrus and ovulation? I really want to kind of get into this a little bit. I try not to get real deep in the weeds here, and just provide the basic information for the cattlemen that I work with. And so we're going to talk about the structures that grow and die on the ovary and their general function and their general purpose. And there are really two structures that exist on the ovary of a yak. One is a follicle, and the other is the corpus luteum. And they each have distinctive jobs, as you can imagine. The follicle's overall job is to get the animal pregnant. It's to start the pregnancy. The job of the corpus luteum is to maintain pregnancy. So the follicle starts the pregnancy, the corpus luteum maintains the pregnancy. Well, how do they do their job? Well, first of all, okay, if you're looking at an ovary, the follicle, if you're palpating it or looking at it using an ultrasound, a follicle is a balloon-like or really a blister-like structure that sticks out on the surface of the ovary. That follicle contains the oocyte, okay, and so it has half of the genetic material of the germplasm that we need, the germ cells that we need to get the pregnancy. And since it's the follicle's job to start pregnancy, then it's the follicle's job to get both germ cells in the reproductive tract at the same time. The follicle does that by producing a hormone called estrogen. Now, one thing you're going to notice as we go through here, and one thing I'm going to point out as we go through here is a reproductive physiologist back in the day when they were discovering these hormones named them by their main biological action. That makes it much easier to understand what the hormone is doing. If we take the ovaries out of an animal and we pull the fluid out of this follicle and we inject it in the animal, she comes into heat. Okay, we call heat estrous. So if we take fluid from that follicle and we inject it into an animal that doesn't have ovaries and we get estrus, something in that fluid was generating estrus. That hormone was identified as estrogen, and they named it for its biological action. It is the estrus generating hormone. So as this follicle grows on the ovary, it produces more and more estrogen. That estrogen goes up to the brain, goes to the behavior centers in the brain, and it says, hey, it's time to act weird. And so all of a sudden, I mean, if you really just pay attention to yaks, they don't do a whole lot, right? They graze, they'll ruminate, they nurse their calf, and that's about it. Well, when you get all this estrogen up in the brain and the limbic system up there, it stimulates massive activity. So you're going to see a 10 to 20-fold increase in activity. This data is all verified by data in yaks. Either they're going to urinate a lot, they're going to move a lot, they're going to be much more active just in general, just walking around, moving a lot more than normal. They'll actually get a little bit of an aroma to them, okay? And the end-all be-all is they will allow another animal, either male or female, to jump on their back and they'll sit still. If there's a male around, and let's say you've got a bull over across the fence, the females will go over to the fence. And so you can see some of this weird activity, this unusual activity, this estrus activity that's stimulated by the estrus generating hormone that's produced by the follicle. So estrogen's up there stimulating estrus behavior, and there's a bull in the pen, the bull jumps the cow, mounts the cow, breeds the cow. Now we have sperm in the reproductive tract. So that's half of the germ cells that we need. Remember, the follicle starts pregnancy, and so now we have the sperm in the tract. We also need to get the egg in the tract. And so while that estrogen's beating around in the brain, stimulating estrous behavior, it goes to another center of the brain. And once it reaches a threshold amount, it stimulates the surge release of a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, or we know it as GnRH. And that goes to another area of the brain that stimulates the surge release of a hormone called LH. Okay. And LH causes the follicle to burst and release the egg. That process is called ovulation. And remember, ovulation occurs about 10 to 12 hours after the onset, after estrus is finished, or about 24 hours after estrus began. Well, why in the world do we wait 24 hours? Well, sperm actually have to be in the reproductive tract 18 to 24 hours before it gains the ability to bind to the egg. So it makes sense that you get sperm deposited first. It gets ready to bind the egg, then we have the egg deposited, then sperm and egg get together and we have fertilization. Once that follicle bursts and releases the egg, the cells kind of collapse and they form the second structure called the corpus luteum, or we just say CL for short. Corpus luteum is Latin for yellow body, because about 500 years ago, an Italian dude was digging around in a bunch of rabbit guts, found this thing that looked like a grape cluster, took a pair of scissors and cut into it, and it was yellow on the inside, and they call it the yellow thing. Corpus luteum, yellow body. Okay? Luteinizing hormone that stimulates the follicle to burst and form the corpus luteum, luteinizing, it's the yellowing hormone. So now all of a sudden we know what luteinizing hormone does too. Okay? Luteinizing hormone is called a gonadotropin. And so a gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of gonadotropin. See, reproductive physiologists are not very unique. We're not very creative people. We just kind of name things for what they are. Okay? And so once that follicle collapses, forms a CL, that CL becomes a solid structure and it produces a hormone that maintains pregnancy. That hormone is called progesterone, and that's pro as in favors, gestational hormone. Progestational hormone, it's the hormone that favors pregnancy. As a matter of fact, an animal can't be pregnant without progesterone in the system. It's biologically impossible. When an animal's pregnant, we rarely see them in heat, not always, but rarely. And so progesterone, one of its main actions is to prevent the expression of estrus. The animal's pregnant, what do we need them in heat again for? Okay, so when progesterone's in the system, estrogen can't act for the most part. Okay, and when progesterone's in the system, that sets the uterus up to support the pregnancy for the entire period of gestation. So how do these change from one heat to the next or one estrus to the next? I'm kind of depicting this here. Here's a follicle. It's got an egg in it. Kind of looks like an eyeball there now that I look at it, and it looks kind of funny. But anyway, that's supposed to depict the oocyte inside the follicle. That follicle is producing estrogen. It stimulates estrus. It stimulates ovulation, which is the burst of the follicle and release of the egg. Once that follicle bursts and that one dies, a new wave of follicles begin to grow, and this wave grows. But since there's progesterone in the system, it inhibits this follicle from going on, so this follicle dies. As soon as it dies, another wave grows. As soon as it dies, another wave grows, and this one happens to be growing when the CL is dying, and so this one's able to stimulate estrus and ovulation. Ultrasonography has not been used, to my knowledge, in yaks to verify 3 waves, but there has been some really good endocrinological data that demonstrates that you get a peak of estrogen on around day 5 and a peak of estrogen on around day 14. That's just a little bit less than the peak that you see around estrus and ovulation. That makes a lot of sense then that a lot of yaks are probably 3-wave cows. Okay, and so that means that 3 waves of follicles grow between each estrus. What about the CL? What happens to the CL? Well, remember at estrus, we've got this big dominant follicle and it's stimulating estrus. It also stimulates the follicle to burst, release the egg, and form the CL. And this is a newly formed CL. You can actually see the hole right there that formed in the wall of the follicle that allowed the egg to be released. Then as that animal gets further and further from heat, the CL gets a little bigger. You can see it turning yellow here. Until around day 15, 16 of the cycle, that CL is as big as it's going to get, and it's producing a ton of progesterone. Somewhere between day 15 and day 17, the animal's got to determine whether or not it's pregnant. If it is not pregnant, then a hormone is released from the uterus that kills the CL, and that allows the follicle that just happens to be growing right here to stimulate the next heat. If the animal is pregnant, then the CL is maintained, progesterone is maintained, and estrus doesn't occur. This just gives you these cyclic changes in the hormones. Again, this is estrus. Estrus occurs here. We really count the first day of the estrus cycle as the first moment that a cow will allow another animal to jump its back. That's stimulated, that heat behavior is stimulated by this huge release of estrogen that's produced by the follicle. Remember, that also goes to the brain and stimulates the release of GnRH. That GnRH releases LH, the yellowing hormone, that then yellows the follicle, making it form the corpus luteum. I bring GnRH up because we can buy GnRH, and we use GnRH routinely in our estrus synchronization protocols, and we use it to kill follicles. So when we give GnRH, what we're trying to do is to make a follicle burst and release the egg and form a CL. As CL is formed at around day 2, it starts producing progesterone. It's producing more and more and more and more and more and more. Okay, and then here, somewhere around day 15, 16, 17, the cow's got to decide whether she's pregnant or not. If she is not pregnant, the uterus releases prostaglandin. Now, you will have heard of that hormone. That's luteolase, that's estromate, that's estroplan. That's the hormone that we give to often to induce heat in animals. But it's released normally by the uterus. It travels to the ovary. It kills the CL. And as the CL dies, progesterone goes away. And that allows this follicle, the one that was growing here toward the end of the cycle, to continue its growth, produce enough estrogen to stimulate the next heat. So that's I would say brief, but that wasn't very brief, an overview of just general cyclicity in the animal, in yaks. Again, very similar to beef cattle. And so if you're familiar with beef cattle endocrinology and changes in the ovarian structures, it's virtually the same. What's not the same is gestation. Gestation length is shorter in yaks. It's somewhere in that 250 to 260 range, according to the literature. And the other thing that is somewhat consistent, but a little bit exaggerated in yaks, is the anestrus period. So after calving, all cows become anestrus. An meaning no, estrus. Okay. And so they'll undergo a period of time where they don't cycle. The anestrus period ranges from about as short as 70 to as long, really, as about 2 years in some real extreme situations. There's actually literature that dictates well over a year of anestrus in some yak females. And again, thorough examination of literature, anestrus is the dominant factor regulating or impacting the reproductive ability in yaks. The problem with anestrus is it occurs every single year of the animal's life. They're anestrus prior to going through puberty, and they'll go through puberty somewhere in that 2 to 3 years of age, again, depending upon the amount of nutrients that are available to the animal. And then after every single calving event, a cow will go anestrus between 70 and, in general, 200 days. And the literature says the average is about 120 to 130. Okay, so you're looking at 4 to 4.5 months where they're not cycling. If an animal is not cycling, if it's not coming into heat or not ovulating an oocyte, it cannot get pregnant. Okay, so regulating the length of this anestrus period and impacting the length of this anestrus period is very important. A term that you're going to hear for the anestrus period is postpartum interval. That's the number of days from when they calve to when they begin to cycle again. So the anestrus period, if it's 70 days, the postpartum interval is 70 days. Okay. There was one instance where I found postpartum interval as short as 45 days, but that was in one animal in one experiment with several thousand animals reported. Again, the anestrus period is confounded by body condition score and the extreme nutritional stress that these animals typically go under. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like, okay, so here's the size of the structure. Here's a day of the year, okay, I've got estrus cycle here, but it's really day of the year. This is the CL. So here, the CL is on the ovary, it's producing progesterone, and as long as the CL is on the ovary, nothing's going to happen. When the calf is ready to come out, it stimulates the death of the CL. Okay, so the CL dies, progesterone goes away, the cow calves. Cow then undergoes a period of time where there is no CL on the ovary. That's the anestrus period. Okay, after the right amount of nutrients in the right amount of time, the animal really starts growing follicles. Here's what happens. And one of them just gets big enough to stimulate ovulation. A lot of times you don't see heat there. If you do, conception rate is 0% because this first heat is almost always abnormally short. So this follicle will burst, release the egg, form the CL. It'll go great for about the first 7 to 10 days, and then uterus will release prostaglandin too early. And so this first cycle is typically short. We call it the short cycle because, again, we're not very creative. The animal will typically come in heat here, but fertility is not normal. And then after this first heat, conception rate or the ability of the animal to conceive at that one heat reaches normal levels. I've got this at a very short postpartum. Again, remember, if this cow is calving on the 1st of March and she's normal, so you're looking at 1st of April, 1st of May, 1st of June, 1st of July, 4 months before she begins to cycle. Okay, and so that's kind of depicted here. We've got 4 different cows calving on March the 1st. This one cycled back 70 days later. We're in pretty good shape with her because we're trying to get these animals bred somewhere here in May and June. All right, so she had a short postpartum interval. She came back in heat very quickly. She's going to have an opportunity to get bred before we get into the summer months. This cow with 90 days, a little bit more limited. This cow with 110 days, conception rate is going to be extremely low on that cow, even though she's cycling because of the heat stress issues that we have here in Kentucky and other places of the U.S. And then finally, the cow that cycles back 4 months later, or this is 130 days here. She's going to be one of those that skips and waits until it cools down again before she actually conceives. What are some of the factors that regulate the length of anestrus? The 2 main things are the presence of the calf and body condition score. Dr. Limcooler, I didn't find too much data on age, but age is a dominant factor in beef cattle, and I assume that it is in yaks, that younger animals take longer to recover from calving than older animals, and therefore, instead of it being 4 months, they're going to be 5 to 6 months before they can recover from calving. And then calving date has a huge impact, although to me it's pretty interesting. In China, in India, Mongolia, where some of this research was done, cows that calved in March actually had much longer postpartum intervals than cows that calved in May. And if you think about it, they were calving, these cows calving in May are calving when nutrient availability is actually becoming higher. Okay, and so you get a little bit of a flushing effect, and so those animals respond to that added nutrient in the system, and they begin to cycle. So the cows calving here in May actually cycled back 70 to 90 days later, versus some of these cows were 140 to 150 days. Cows calving in March were much thinner than the cows calving in May too. The presence of the calf is a very dominant factor in beef cattle, and appears to be a pretty dominant factor in yaks. Okay, we don't really know the whole mechanism, but we know it's both the physical contact of the calf nursing the cow and the mere presence of the calf or the maternal bond that impacts it. Some research in yaks, and there really hasn't been any short-term calf removal done in yak that I have been able to see, but yaks milked once a day had normal postpartum intervals of between 70 and 120 days, versus yaks milked twice a day had much longer. You're looking at 130 to 150 days of anestrus. And so the frequency of the milking, the demand on the animal's lactation, and how that impacted her ability to recycle was pretty dramatic. In beef cattle, where there's been a ton of data, if you take the calf off for 48 hours, it will absolutely induce estrus in nearly 100% of anestrus females. And just a little bit of this data, and I know these are small numbers, but honestly, these are the last two papers that really looked at this in an intense fashion. There's been, from 1975 to 1990, about 250,000 cow-calf pairs that went through this work. I've done some of this work myself. In these two trials, these are literally the last two that you can really find that were dedicated to this. Beef cows were between 30 and 45 days after calving, when the calves were removed for 48 hours, and 80 to 100% of them cycled. They had short cycles, but they were cycling. And it still remains an extremely effective biological controller of estrus in beef cattle and in yaks. This is, I've personally done it. I didn't have any issues at all with the calves. Every now and then the cows' udders would get a little sore, and we'd have to get the cows in and milk them down to get some of that soreness out of the udder. But otherwise, we didn't really have any sickness at all in the yaks. And so if we were turning the bulls out, let's say, this coming Monday, we would take the calves off Monday morning, turn the bulls out, take the calves back Wednesday morning, and that's that. Watch to make sure everything's nursing, and that bull's going to be going to town about that time. And so it's going to be pretty easy to see the impact. And Dr. Limcooler running a trial like this on some postpartum yaks is going to be kind of interesting, I think, if we pick this up on some of those that we've gotten AI'd out at Greg's. Body condition score is a massive regulator of the length of the anestrus period. Dr. Limcooler has worked really hard to come up with and to publish data on using body condition scores in yak. He has adopted a similar score to what we see in beef cattle, where 1 is emaciated and 9 is extremely obese. And remember, it's just an estimate of the available energy that's in that animal's body. It's just an estimation of the energy stores in her body. So just from Dr. Limcooler's work, again, a body condition score 1 is a cow that's emaciated. And so there's a lot of places that you look, but we like to look over the ribs. We like to look down the spine and look at the transverse and spinous processes. You look down here through the shoulder, okay? And what you're looking for is sharpness, okay? Sharpness, and so here every rib is visible, a very sharp spine. Both the spinous and transverse processes here in the paralumbar fossa are extremely visible. body condition score one animal is going to be a year before, I mean, unless some massive nutrition is done. If Dr. Lim Cooler worked his nutritional magic on her, you might have a chance in 6 months, but it's not going to occur before then. This body condition score 4 cow, you can see she's a little fleshier. There's less visibility here on the ribs, and Dr. Lim Cooler can jump in when he wants to. Since the yaks are so hairy, you really got to kind of get in there and feel the sharpness to make sure you're getting a really accurate depiction. But you'll feel the sharpness over the ribs, the sharpness here in the transverse and spinous processes. Go back to the pins, which are these bones right there. Okay, look at the sharpness over the pins, and the hook bones, hooks and the pins right here. That's hooks, that's pins there, and looking for the sharpness over the hooks and the pins. What we're really looking for is a little bit of fat. Okay, we want enough fat on there that the ribs aren't visible, and we get a little bit of fat deposited here along the vertebrae. And you can really not palpate sharpness to the transverse or spinous processes. You get back here on the hook bones, and they've got a little coverage and a little bit of coverage back on the pins. Body condition score 5 really is what we determine is really kind of the necessary to maximize reproduction. Data from beef cattle, just to show you the impact. This is the percent cycling at the start of the breeding season. This is the body condition score at calving. So as body condition score at calving increases, the percent cycling at the start of the breeding season increases. I really like a condition score 6 in my beef cows, because when I'm at 80% cycling and 70% conception, that means 60%, close to 60% of all the females are going to get an opportunity to get pregnant early in the cycle. And so that improves our ability to get these animals bred quickly. How it pertains to yaks, and again, Dr. Lim Cooler, chime in when you want to add here. But really what we want to be able to discern the differences between our predict condition score 3 cows, 3 and 4, and our condition score 5 and 6. So we looked at a 5 a little bit ago. Here, this 6 is getting a little shelfy. Certainly got plenty of, you'll be able to palpate about a 1/2 inch to a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch across the ribs and across the vertebrae, or the spinous processes here. This animal is going to be sharp on all those places. It's going to be at minimum 4 to 5 months before she recycles, at minimum. And her ability to calve every 400 days, basically 0. Okay, and it's just math. Biology combined with math. This cow, body condition score 6, she's going to have minimum length of an estrous. And so she'll cycle back in 70 days, and so she will have ample opportunity to get pregnant and calve in a 365-day window. So we're really looking for 5s and 6s, and we're really looking to find those 3s and 4s and increase the nutrient density of their diet and nutrient intake and availability to those animals. I like to think of them as a water tank. Dr. Lim Cooler and Greg will tell you I'm a very simple-minded person. I got to put things very simply for myself to organize it. And so when this cow calves, if you think of her body as a water tank, when she calves, maybe she's got 50 gallons in there. And so we put the hose in, we turn the nutrients on, and then her tank starts to fill. Okay. And then as that tank gets fuller and fuller and fuller, eventually there's enough water in that tank that it spills out over the edge. And really that's the brain's signal that the cow has enough energy to reproduce. And so to give this a little bit more of a depiction, this is kind of a silly picture, but I think about if this cow has a body condition score 1 or 2, we're down here at the bottom of the tank, Dr. Lim Cooler. We've got just enough energy in this cow's system for her to live, to move, not enough to grow, certainly not enough to put enough fat down, and not nearly enough to come into heat and get pregnant. As we turn those nutrients on, that water tank fills, okay, until eventually we get up here in that 50 to 60 gallon range. And now we've got enough fat reserves, okay, that the animal can think about coming into heat. So then her brain starts that process. And then as that energy continues to fill and that tank continues to fill, eventually it spills out over the edge. The animal senses, the brain senses she has enough energy in her environment and enough energy in her system for her to go ahead and cycle and rebreed. Okay. Now we understand the big problem. The big problem is estrous. How do we solve the problem? I mean, understanding it is nice, but we got to figure out how to solve the problem. Okay. And so, is there a way we can induce an estrous cow to begin to cycle, to come into heat? And fortunately, there is. We've talked about one, short-term calf removal, extremely effective. Extremely effective. If you're not inclined to do that, research has shown that a minimum of 5 days of progesterone can induce an estrous cow to cycle. And actually, there's data on 5 days of progesterone in yaks. Now, those yaks were cycling in some of the experiments, and they used 7 days of progesterone in some other experiments where the animals were not cycling. And the progesterone treatment of the animals was extremely effective in getting them in heat and getting them pregnant earlier. What we're doing there, and you've seen this graph before, is what we're trying to do is to mimic what actually occurs in nature. Again, reproductive physiologists are not creative. We try to match what's going on with the biology of the cow. We know that right before the animal comes into heat naturally, they have a little bit surge of progesterone, a 7 to 10 day surge of progesterone. We can do that. We can give a cow progesterone. We can actually give her the natural hormone at natural levels and completely trick the brain into thinking she's already ovulated and she's already formed her first CL. And that's really the basis of a ton of work that I've done in beef cattle, and a lot of work that's been done in bovine, a variety, water buffalo, bison, etc., where progesterone is administered for a period of time, it's removed, and then the animal is bred. Okay, and in this situation, we're just turning in bulls. A lot of times we're using estrous synchronization and the CEDAR device to stimulate and control estrus so that we can AI. The real goal of the CEDAR, okay, and we'll talk about the CEDAR in just a second, is to get animals to cycle quicker so they can get pregnant quicker, so they can spend less time piddling around in estrus. CEDAR stands for Controlled Internal Drug Release, and unfortunately, I'm old enough to have been involved in all of the clearance and FDA work for the CEDAR device in the U.S. It was approved for use back in the early 90s, and I was heavily involved in all that research done by, at that time, Upjohn. The CEDAR device is this T-shaped plastic device that's coated in progesterone. That white powder, you can see it's white, that is actually progesterone. It's embedded into the plastic, and the body fluids soak up that progesterone, and it gets into the bloodstream, and the brain can't tell where progesterone is coming from. It just knows it's in the bloodstream, and so it thinks it's cycling. So to get that CEDAR device in the animal, we bend the wings up, we put it in this long tube, and you notice we've got this tail sticking out here. We insert it into the vagina of the cow. We leave it in there for at least 5 days, but 7 is what we typically shoot for. We pull the string, pull the CEDAR device out of the vagina, and 80% or so of estrous females will come into heat 2 to 5 days later. Now, I say that with a caveat. You can put all the CEDARs you want into body condition score 2 and 3 yaks, and you're not going to stimulate estrus in very many of them. Okay, the yak is extremely impacted by nutritional and estrous. And so we're going to need to get them in a body condition score 4 minimum before the cedar device will do us much good. Here's a picture of Greg putting in a cedar device and one is Jack. Again, this is the long tube. Well, the tube here is not the blue one. This blue one is the extra long one that we use for beef and dairy cattle. They do have a smaller device. We use the bovine cedars, which contains 1.38 grams of progesterone. I don't think we've lost one yet. There is a small amount of vaginitis that's visible when you remove the cedar, but it hasn't seemed to impact fertility in yak. And I know for a fact that it doesn't impact fertility in beef cattle. So don't really no need really to concern yourself about it. They're very easy to put in, even easier to pull out, and extremely effective. Again, that goes in the anterior vagina. You push the plunger right here. That deposit that kicks it out, the wings stick out, it catches in the vaginal walls. You pull the tube out, the body fluids soak up the hormone, and again, the animal thinks it has a CL, even though it really doesn't. Some data in beef cattle, there's no natural service work done in yak, but we used either the synthetic progestin MGA, which we fed, or we used a cedar device. We fed this for 7 days right before we turned the bull out, and had extremely good luck getting more of these animals pregnant and getting more of them to calve in the first 30 days of the calving window. Bull to cow ratios did not matter as long as we used proven bulls of high fertility. I've actually got data on well over 20,000 animals in this system. This is just the 2,000 we started out with back in 2000 and 2001. And this is really good data, and I think this cedar protocol here is an extremely effective protocol for you guys to consider trying to enhance the reproduction in yak.
Les, do you want to define MGA?
I can if you want me to. Whoop, I think you're unmuted, but I didn't hear you. So MGA is called melangestrol acetate. Okay. And it is a synthetic progesterone that was developed in the 50s. I was not around for the development of that, but I have used MGA extensively over my 35-year career in reproduction. It is the synthetic. So the MGA was originally designed to suppress estrus in feedlot heifers. And so they altered the progesterone molecule so that it doesn't get degraded by the rumen. It bypasses the rumen, it gets into the bloodstream, and but it still has progesterone-like activity. And so the great thing about it is it's orally active, and so it's a feed. You put a 0.5 milligram of MGA in feed, and it effectively tricks the brain into thinking that there's a CL on the ovary. It's been used again since the 50s, used extensively in beef cattle to synchronize estrus for AI in heifers. It is only approved for use to synchronize AI in heifers. And so our use of this was off-label, but it was honestly extremely effective method to induce estrus in anestrus females, particularly if you're in extensive situations where you're not able to handle the animals very well. Dr. Limcooler, if you have anything you want to add to that, there's several different feeds you can buy. You can have it mixed by your feed mill. I'll hush for just a second, let you chat about it.
No, I just wanted you to define what MGA was, and that it's used for synchronizing estrus in heifers or suppressing estrus in heifers in the feedlot, and has the same activity as it would in cows as well. But like you said, it's not labeled to be used in cows.
I only throw this this table in so that you can see how we're using cedar devices to improve reproductive efficiency in beef cattle. None of this work has been done in yak. And so I don't have yak data, but just understanding the philosophy that we're using in beef cattle, you know, I hope to stimulate some thought processes for you. So our problem in beef cattle is to get these late and very late calving cows and our young cows. So primiparis is a single calving, okay. To get our young cows and our very late calving cows to conceive like our early calving cows that have already come into estrus. And so we'll come in 45 days postpartum, put a cedar device in, and get these animals to perform as if they were cycling the entire time. Same thing for the 2-year-olds. The really interesting thing is in beef cattle, we can come in as early as 2 weeks after calving, put a cedar device in for 7 days, pull the cedar device out, and Dr. Limcooler, they breed like, so these are May calving cows that breed like they were March calving cows. And so you're like, well, what do you want to do that for? Well, that scrunches up my calving season. That allows more of our animals to calve early, which means that I have to treat fewer of them next year, and I have a better control of the calving season. I have much less calf death loss. I have much more efficient labor and production efficiency because I've got all my cows calving in a really tight window, and so I can apply all of my management in an extremely efficient fashion. So how do I recommend you consider doing this? Well, the first thing you got to do is figure out when you're going to calve. And this is probably the hardest thing about yak, right? Is to try to figure out when the best time to calve them is. And Greg and Dr. Limcooler and I have beat this over and over and over and around and around and around. But I think we're kind of settling on February and March as our key months to try to target for calving. Another option here is September and October. But the reason we're kind of targeting that early February to March window is, you know, we've got grass coming on. You know, in a couple of months, we're going to be able to hit that pretty well. And I would really kind of recommend, because I know that people from all over the country and maybe even all over the world could be listening to this at some point in time. And so what I would try to do is to identify when you think nutrients are going to be available, and your nutrient density is going to be high. Back that up a month or two, or 3 in the case of yak, and target those windows for your calving windows. You want to insert a cedar device into all cows 7 days right before you turn the bull out. Okay. And I'm sure a lot of you are looking at me like, what do you mean turn the bull out? Bull's out all the time. Okay. That's random reproduction. And I'm not a big fan of random reproduction. Random reproduction means that you're really not managing your cattle to calve at a time when it's efficient for you as a manager to apply your management. Okay, so if you're calving year round and you happen to have calving problems and you're not watching them every single day, you're going to have a higher calf death loss. If you're trying to vaccinate, you're going to have to figure out when the best time to vaccinate them, and you're going to be vaccinating much more often. If you're trying to feed to the nutrient needs, right after they calve, the lactation demand of the yak goes way up. And so you're going to need to feed those animals higher. And so everything, all of management is dictated by when those doggone things calve. And let's quit being random in our management. Let's be precise. Let's be controlled to give ourselves an opportunity to profit, or an opportunity to be efficient, even if profit's not 100% possible all the time. If your bulls happen to be with the cows year round, just let them go on vacation for a week to 10 days. Put them up in a lot somewhere. Do something with them. Get them away from the cows for at least the week that they're in there. Yeah, that the cedar device is in your cows. Just an example. Okay, again, we're going to calve that January, February, March here, late January, concentrate on February and some March. Why? Well, that weather here at that time frame is actually pretty gentle compared to the Himalayas. So that's a pretty good time for calving for us, and actually yak are set up to handle the cold weather. So I'm not real concerned about them calving in the cold. There's no real calving problems that I've heard of, or Greg or Dr. Lemcooler's talked about. So, getting out and pulling those calves in poor weather is not something that we have to deal with that much in yak. And we've got our grass coming in 3 months. All right. And so that's pretty important. That gives us an opportunity for those animals to get in, get that peak part of their lactation over. Here comes the grass. They're going to be able to recover quickly. And we're going to be able to start them and get them pregnant before our heat stress issues occur. The main reason that we've chosen this window is here in end-of-fight country, June 20th to July 1st is really kind of a cutoff for us. We've got end-of-fight infected fescue, and the heat stress that amplifies in our animals becomes really very potent. What happens is we get a severe decline in conception rate. One thing about the yak that really impressed me is their conception rate is exceptionally high. I mean, you're looking at 75% in nearly every publication I've seen. When they get the animal in decent condition and they're cycling, those doggone things get pregnant at a very high rate. Not when they're thin, not when it's hot. Okay. And so we want to target trying to get our animals pregnant before June 20th because of the heat stress and the severe depression and conception rate. Another thing that we have observed and others have observed, you can find in the literature, is abortion rate in yaks can be extremely high, up to 50%. There was one trial that was discussed in China where they had an extreme weather event come in. Of course, their weather event was winter, not summer, but they literally lost half of the calf crop. Okay, we have observed 20 to 25% abortion rates due to heat stress here, or we assume it's due to heat stress, because when we breed the animals at other times of the year, we don't have that same abortion rate. This should be calving rate, not CR. So the conception rate declines, calving rate will decrease. So the percentage of the yak that actually calve, and then weaning rate, of course, will decrease as well. Just to give you an example, putting the calendar dates down, if we were turning our bulls out on May the 11th, we would remove them from the cows before May 3rd, put the cedar device in cows on May 3rd, pull them out on May 10th, put the bulls in with the cows on May 11th. Once those bulls are in for 70 to 90 days, remove them if you can. If you can't, then go ahead and schedule a pregnancy diagnosis about 120 days after you put the bull in, or after the start of your breeding season. I would recommend ultrasonography if you have a veterinarian that can do that. One thing that I've been kind of impressed with and been very interesting to me is the palpation of yak is actually pretty easy. It's not nearly as difficult as I thought it would be. Now I've palpated, not exaggerating, millions, maybe a million. I've palpated a lot of cattle. And so I have experience with it. And so that probably makes the palpation experience easier for me. But the ultrasonography looks exactly the same. It's fairly easy to do, and it's really accurate at 30 days after the bulls turned out, or 30 days of pregnancy. If you can't find a veterinarian or get some ultrasonography done, and this is a picture of me and Greg at his place, getting some ultrasound work finished. You could try blood sampling. We did on one cow that I remember. We used the alerts, ALERTYS, shoot side pregnancy test, and we got it to work in an animal that we diagnosed using the ultrasound as pregnant. What happens here, if just the test itself, you get the red line. If the animal ends up pregnant, you'll get another red line. If she's not pregnant, there'll only be one red line. Again, we used it, I can't remember the stage, I think it was around 100 days of pregnancy, and it lit up, and we were surprised. The IDEX people didn't think it would work, but it did. And I honestly, I think it would, if yak reproduction is very similar to beef cattle reproduction and dairy cattle reproduction, as far as the endocrinology and the ovarian cyclicity. And so I would assume that the IDEX would work well. Just to summarize, I've gone a little bit longer than I expected. So I apologize for that, but yak reproduction is really similar to beef cattle. I'm tickled with that because, again, it's a book that I've read many times, and so I'm familiar with it. Some things that make yak unique: the 30 days shorter gestation, the silent heats are very, very, very weak heats, the high abortion rates, and some of the reports are pretty substantial out of China, India, and so forth. And certainly they're more susceptible to heat stress. And so getting them bred, the seasonal nature of them when they're wanting to breed in June, July, and August, we're battling heat stress there, okay? So we kind of got to back that up just a little bit. And then managing estrous is the whole deal. Get the cows in good body condition. If they're a little bit thin, okay, you might try 24 to 48 hours short-term calf removal. The cedar device will be extremely effective, whether you're trying to AI or just use natural service. But I absolutely recommend that you attempt to manage estrous in some fashion so that you can attempt to manage your calving season and your productivity and profitability. And with that, Dr. Lim Cooler, I'm finished. Took about 10 minutes longer than I expected, and I apologize for that.
No worries. So one of the things that I like to do in these sessions is, and one of the reasons that we kind of started along this line was what I call myth busting. So this past week, actually just 2 days ago, on a very popular social media platform, this was stated. Also, keep in mind, yak gestation window is 9 to 9.5 months long, and estrus lasts 3 weeks.
That's completely and utterly wrong.
So this is part of the myth busting that we do here. Now, Dr. Anderson, I've got another question in relation to that. There was a question that came up about cows are not calving this. They didn't calve last year, and they haven't calved yet this year. They thought it maybe is a mineral deficiency. They've got a bull that they've gotten 2 years ago, and the bull age now is almost 5. So it's been basically 2 years that they hadn't had calves. Last year, they indicated that the entire herd went through a sickness and they all got sick. The bull shows interest with the cows, but they have not preg checked anything to know if the cows are bred or not, but they normally would have calves May through July, and they've not had any calves basically for the last 2 years. So what's your thoughts?
Do you want me to be honest?
Be honest.
That's random management. You're just taking whatever happens. Okay. 2 things has got to be done immediately. Get them preg checked. Okay. Get a vet out, get them preg checked, have them use an ultrasound. And, since they don't have calves, and that's going to allow the producer to determine where the animal is if they happen to be pregnant. If none of them are pregnant, I would probably go to a bull problem. Okay. So the other thing is get the doggone bulls tested for breeding soundness. Okay. We have had a lot of experience with the bulls at Greg's. It's not different than collecting bull. I mean, they're going to be a little bit more sensitive to the probe, right? A little more sensitive to the probe. So gotta turn down the voltage just a little bit. But we haven't had any trouble collecting semen at all. And there is some seasonal issues with the semen quality that you got to pay attention to. But all the bulls returned to acceptable quality semen as it got cooler. Okay. And so either that bull is permanently infertile, which is my 100% guess there. That bull he's showing interest, but my guess is he can't get cows pregnant. But start doing preg checks, get that bull breeding soundness examined. And once you have those two vital pieces of information, now we can start diving into, okay, maybe we have a mineral deficiency. But usually a mineral deficiency that results in zero pregnancy also results in dead calves, right? Dead calves, calves that don't grow, cows that eventually die. Okay, if the mineral deficiency is that bad, you'll see it. Right or wrong?
Right. And I think because there's randomness, as you mentioned, and the herd has not gotten up to be preg checked and the herd got sick, there's probably a lack of preventative herd health as well. And we know that yaks get pretty much all the same diseases that cattle get.
Yep. I'd be very, suspicious of BVD. Okay. BVD, of course, one vector for BVD is deer, right? You've got multiple other vectors, animals that carry the disease. If there's stockyard cattle anywhere around, if those yak have never been vaccinated for BVD, and they're exposed to high levels of BVD, one of the things that does, Dr. Limcooler, is that stimulates repeat breeding. I mean, they just go on. I mean, they just come in heat every 20, 21 days over and over and over and over again until you get rid of until either immunity exceeds the challenge or the challenge decreases. And so, but I would absolutely start with the simplest explanations and get the bull checked first, get the cow's pregnancy diagnosed second. And then if the bull and do that, during the cooler part. So right now would be a great time, right? But you can't wait until June and July and August because their ability to produce sperm is going to be lower there. And then ours recover by November, right? So
The December, I mean, for us, we had a pretty warm fall, and so it was more in that December timeframe. But yeah, you'll get some that will recover quicker. And of course, Mr. Meat Bull, he wasn't affected at all, right?
Yeah,
He bred
he
everything.
wasn't affected at all.
So another quick or kind of follow up, Les, is you mentioned that silent or that weaker estrus. There's been several discussions about that makes it a challenge to artificially inseminate, but does that make it a challenge for the bulls for natural breeding as well, do you think?
I really don't think it does. And, there are other, Boss Indicus cattle are very shy as well. And, we kid around about them all the time, but they do all their work at night. And there's a ton of activity data on that. I mean, I'm assuming that yak are exactly the same. That they start showing estrous behavior at 10 to 11 at night, and they'll stop in that 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning. And that window is not a window we're out there very often. Okay. It'll drag on a little bit. I mean, I know Greg does a really good job checking heat, but one of the things about it too is, and it's hard to teach people this, but actually pay attention to your animals for a second. Just kind of watch them on random normal days. And then when they're starting to act a little different, you'll be able to pick it up. And so sometimes you don't necessarily have to watch an animal get ridden to know that she's in heat, if that makes any sense at all.
Sure.
And particularly, I mean, if you've got a male on the farm and it's not with the cows, and he's put him next to the fence, if your fence can handle it, and I guarantee you, your cows are going to back up to that fence. I mean, we've seen it out at Greg's.
Yeah.
Greg sees it. I'm sure Ron probably sees it in his cattle as well. And so, the subtle there, it's just not as obvious. The differences are still there. It's just not as obvious. And I think, I'm confident that Greg identifies when his cattle are in heat pretty accurately.
Yeah.
And it's because he knows those yak. He knows them, right? I mean, he knows them. So.
Anybody else got any questions? Ron, Greg? I'm not sure who's on our phone, but if you want to unmute and ask a question, go ahead.
I have a question. This is Ron. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you bet, Ron. Go ahead.
What does it cost for the CIDR test on a per cow basis? And I saw Greg on that. So can we be trained to do that ourselves?
To put the cedar in, or to do the shoot side pregnancy test?
Yes. Put the cedar in.
Oh yeah, I mean it's so simple, even a nutritionist can do it.
Yes, I can do it.
I mean, it really is. I mean, I have, and actually, I tell you what, we're going to be putting cedars in 2 weeks, Jeff?
Yeah, 2 weeks.
We'll do an educational video on how to put cedars in yak. How about that?
And then
We'll put it up on your educational site.
That'd be great. What
I think they were about
cost?
I think it was like $138 for 10. Does that sound right, Jeff?
Yeah. Cost is going to be somewhere around $12 to $13 a piece, and you can reuse them. If you pull them, wash them, just knock the junk off of them, dip them down in some, we usually use like a chlorhexidine, or Novosan is the brand that we usually use, but put them down in there for just a few minutes, then rinse that off, let them dry. You can use them twice within a calendar year. And so, what we're doing at Greg's is we're sinking them and then resinking them. And so we can actually use the same cedar both times if we want to. So, I mean, it cuts our costs down quite a bit, really. So, if you're not inclined to want to do that, really the 13 in beef cattle, we're looking at, a nearly 7 to 10-fold return on investment for using cedars right before natural service. I assume that that's going to be even greater in yak, Dr. Lemcooler, because of the incredible issue with estrous in yak.
Another question I've got is, so what you would recommend is that we probably have our cows' pregnancy checked, April, something like that. I've had poor management up until now. We had a bull and we just didn't have the facilities where we could separate the bulls away from the herd. We've now split our herd. We've got our steers and heifers in one herd. We've got our cows in another. We've got our bulls separated. So we're just now getting to where we probably should have been 2 years ago. So knowing that we're going to put our bulls in with the cows in September and pull them out in March. So would you recommend we probably have pregnancy tests done on our cows in April? And then if they're, for the ones that aren't pregnant, use the cedars on them and put the bulls back in with them 7 days after we do the cedars?
Definitely get them preg checked in April. That's going to
Okay.
tell you, that's going to tell you what your success rate of your September to March calving window was. Then you really won't have to do anything until right before you get ready to turn the bull in again, unless you're wanting to change your calving season. If you want to concentrate it there in that September to March window, then I would just wait until 7 days before you turn the bull out in September. And every animal that has calved, that's a body condition score at least 4, cedar in for 7 days, pull the cedar out, turn the bull in.
I'd love to change our calving season. It's to do that, we're probably going to have to almost skip one. I say that, but last year we didn't start having calves until July 2nd. I think our bull's semen is affected. It was so hot the year before, our bull's semen was probably affected until October, November. We didn't have cows start getting pregnant until the end of November, 1st of December, which is probably the semen, I would guess, in the bull's problem.
Yeah, I mean, based upon the stuff that Jeff and Greg has done, I'd say that's 100% accurate.
Yeah. So we'd love to start changing it so we can start having our calves, because we see the same. I mean, we're further north than you guys, but our winters are not bad at all. I think we had 2 inches of snow this year. We had a little bit of cold weather, but these guys are built for cold weather.
Yeah.
So I don't think it affects the calves at all.
I can't imagine that a yak even thinks it's cold here.
Yeah.
Biologically,
I'd mentioned to Greg and Jeff before that this is the key, in my opinion, to yaks being viable or not in the United States. We've got to get this calving down, and we lost almost half of our calves last year. We started calving on July 2nd. We ended up with our last calf on October 29th, and we had 27 calves and lost 13 of them. And the heat just killed us, killed us. So we've moved the cows this year into woods. So we're hoping the cows will have the calves in the woods, which should help with the heat, but we need to change the season. That's the only way to really address the problem.
Yeah. And just, talking through, brainstorming through with Jeff and Greg, I really think our January, February, March calving is ideal for Appalachia, in South Central, whatever you want to call Kentucky, because we have to get them bred. They have to get pregnant before June 20th, or they're not going to. They could conceive, but they're going to abort. I mean, how many did we lose, Greg? I mean, good night. We work hard to get those doggone AI pregnancies, and we lost all of them but one.
That was on that cold weather snap, yeah.
And so, anyway, that's a window that I think we're targeting. It makes a lot of sense from both the male and female side. And, I don't think the yak are really going to pay any attention whatsoever to a January, February, early March calving in our environment at all. And it's going to make it a whole lot easier to get them pregnant.
For our farm, it would probably have to start this next year, because this year's a little bit too late for us. We're supposed to get up in the upper 80s starting next week. And so we're going to go into heat right away here. And of course, now we haven't had any calves. So here we go, upper 80s, and we're probably going to start having calves. But I had a question for you. If you're gonna put, if you're gonna do the cedar on the 1st of May and put your bull in with them 7 days later, are you gonna run into and you pull the bull out 90 days later? Are you gonna run into a problem with the semen in the bull when it starts getting hot? Just like next week, we're gonna get 90 degrees. I don't know how long it takes for that semen to start going down and sperm count start going down, but were you running a problem with that or not? Or my question, I guess, is, should we start in April when it's going to, we know it's going to be cool for another 30 to 60 days?
Yeah, absolutely. You absolutely could. My goal is to get them pregnant before June 20th. That's our goal, because out of 10 years, okay, before June 20th, we may see a suppression in fertility 2 out of 10 years, maybe before June 20th. The other 8 years, we're in pretty good shape but I'm in Kentucky, particularly if you go to Western Kentucky down to Princeton, June 20th is the absolute day when conception rate starts to decline pretty drastically. Dr. Burris did a lot of that work, and I'm working on the fact that we're up here in Central Kentucky. July 1st is kind of our cutoff in beef cattle. I think yaks are a little bit more susceptible to our heat stress because of the hair coat and so forth. So I backed that up 10 days. And I think that coincides with some of the data that we had collected, Dr. Limcooler. So we're going to try to get a heat around get them, May 10th, okay, May 30th, June 20th. That's 3 heats, and all the data with cattle, with yak females in good body condition like Greg's are now. We've licked it. We'll have 90% of them bred then, because the conception rate data, published data on yak females is exceptionally high. I mean, just really good. I mean, there's some papers you can find where their conception rate and body condition score 5, 3 on a 5 scale or 5 to 6 on a 9 scale. I mean, you're looking at 75 to 80% conception rate, the natural service in some of those papers. That's pretty impressive. Now, when you add in the nutritional issues and estrous, even if they're cycling, if they're still really thin, their conception rate's pretty low. But the whole key is getting them in good shape, like you talked about you're doing, Ron, and then get in there and get control of that stuff. And so that end of April, maybe April 20th, May 10th, May 30th ends up being the perfect time for you, to get your 3 cycles in before it gets hot.
With the pregnancy checks, could you say what type of pregnancy checks you guys are doing now?
Well,
one was a
we
blood
use the Les Anderson stick your hand in their hind end ultrasound method.
Okay.
But we have used the alerts twice. I know we had one pregnant female that showed up, and I think she was mid-gestation. I don't remember that, Jeff, but if you remember,
she was further along. We tried it in the 4-week pregnancy, and we couldn't get anything.
That was right.
Yeah.
Now the other folks have said the Bioprine system works.
Bioprime. Okay.
Yeah, Bioprine, PRYN.
Yes, PRYN.
Okay. Yeah, we actually had our vet out 2 years ago. We had a lady vet, and she did the hand in, and she was very accurate. She tested 11 cows, and 10 of them were pregnant, and we had a good calf herd that year. So she was pretty much right on. We might just try that again, because she was
I'd
so
say
accurate
that'd be your
before.
best bet. I'd say that's your best bet.
Okay.
And if in some areas of the country, in some areas of Kentucky, you can't find a large animal veterinarian. And so in those situations, when you can't get the palpation done by a qualified veterinarian, like, you know, I mean, you got one that's really knows what she's doing. In those cases where you don't have that person, the alerts, ALERTYS, or the blood sample and send it to a bioprine lab, it'd be what I would suggest.
Okay, thank you. This has been very, very helpful to me. You know, the yak industry still at its infancy, and this is something that, you know, I've talked to Greg before. If we're going to be able to have commercial size herds, what our goal is, we're raising meat yaks, and we've just started marketing our meat. It's been we sold out of all of our steaks. We butchered 6 yaks, and we sold out of all of our steaks in 6 weeks, and all we have is hamburger now to sell. And we go to a farmer's market that gets about 4,000 people a Saturday morning in 5 hours, and we're just selling yak meat like mad. We've got hides, things like that, but the problem is we don't have the product. You know, now we're developing our market, but we've got to get more yaks, which gets back to, we've got to start hitting that 80-90% pregnancy where we can be raising them.
The last 2 reviews that I read, Ron, one was done in 2006. I think the other one was 2001, and they were talking about trials with a couple hundred yaks, and they were getting over 90% preg rates when they were applying the reproductive techniques that we're talking about, using the cedar devices.
Okay.
At the appropriate times of the year for that. I mean, it was all Himalayan oriented. So they were doing it, and, you know, they were there. It was in July and August there, but the impressive thing to me about yak is their conception rate is very high when you've got their body condition in good shape. And so once we get the calving season established, and then that allows us to stack the rest of our management on top of it. Because the problem with that, with not controlling calving, is then all of a sudden you don't really control anything. And it's hard to get your vaccine program. It's really hard to get your nutritional program. It's really hard to get everything done on a schedule so that it becomes efficient for you as a manager to really apply management. And so what happens then is we just say, okay, whatever, and we don't do it. And that's not, I mean, that's every cattle producer, and so, or yak, either one. And so really kind of the heart and soul of great management starts with controlling the calving season. And if that's one thing that we can do for yak, and then that's something that we've, that's a real accomplishment, because we haven't been able to do it for any other kind of cattle.
Sounds great.
The only other thing I'll say, Ron, is Dr. Prater and Dr. Harrelson will follow up later in the year and present some of the cryopreservation or the freezing data, and also some of the impacts of heat stress on bulls. And there's certainly, like we know in the beef animals, there's bull to bull variability in the ability to freeze the sperm, and there's variability in heat susceptibility.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, ours vary collection to collection, depending on what's going on. I mean, one month everybody's firing well, the next month somebody's, not working well, or 1 out of 3 will be working, and then 2 months later everybody's fine.
I think you'll find that in beef bulls as well.
Yeah, I think that as weather systems change and climate changes and stuff, we're just going to be more in tune with that as well. For all the bulls heat stress and the cows heat stress and everything else, that's going to be an issue that we just can't assume that it's the weather is going to be the same. So that's going to affect how we set up our calving seasons as well.
Let's, or Jeff or Greg, can any of you guys tell me how many cows can one bull service effectively? I just had a bull that went down with a bad leg, and I think I had him servicing too many cows because his leg just went out from under, and he was only probably 5 or 6 years old, so he was not that old. But how many do you guys see one bull being able to service effectively?
A
And I used to
mature, a mature bull that passes a BSE will be able to service fairly easily 25 to 40 females in a season.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even when synchronized.
Okay.
So, now, you have to stack the deck in your favor, Ron. You got to make sure that rascal is producing viable sperm before you turn him out. And if he's got to have at least one season's experience. So your younger bulls, your 4-year-olds that probably haven't had too much experience in the past, be a little kinder to them, put them out with 10, maybe 15, let them figure out the world before you really throw them in, heavy. But, there's actually a lot of data in beef bulls where, we don't give the bull enough credit. And I think a lot of the data that we've collected in synchronization over the years validates that. But I would think that 25 to 40, depending upon the condition of your bull, the quality of the semen, and so forth, is in about the right ballpark for you.
And I know Dr. Prater in his exam of the bull, he really is heavy on the leg structure, Ron.
Yeah.
But that's a key issue for him. The semen's got to be good, but as you found out, the bull's got to be strong enough physically to mount and not get injured all the time.
Right. Would the University of Illinois be able to do a semen test for me?
Your herd vet, the lady that's doing your preg checking, I'm sure she can do a great job at it.
Okay. I'll check with them.
And
Right.
Dr. Prater there at Morehead State, if she has some questions about it, I'm sure he would be more than thrilled to talk to her about some of the things that he's learned about collecting yaks. He's pretty good at it. I mean, just being blunt about it, he's pretty good at it. So if she's a little hesitant or has some questions, he's been a veterinarian for a long time and he's seen almost everything, and he's really good.
Okay. Thank you.
One follow-up question there, Les. 50 cows in a group. You said 25 to 40, therefore 2 bulls. Do you put 2 bulls in with that one group?
I'd rather put 1 bull in or 3 bulls in than 2. I never put 2 bulls in. I would rather go with 1 mature bull that, a Doctor Who or something that we know that, really high pass on his BSE. I'd rather put 1 bull in with 50 than 2. I don't know if yak bulls fight as much as beef bulls do, but all they end up doing is fighting.
Yep.
So if you had 2 bulls, it might be not better to put 1 bull in for 2 weeks and rotate.
So yeah, put your cedar in, pull your cedar out, let your older dominant bull in there by himself at first. 2 weeks later, move that bull out, put your other bull in, let him in for 3 weeks, and rotate him every 3 weeks after that. Or, twice. I mean, if you're just going to leave him in for 3 total cycles. But the data in beef bulls, and I haven't seen anything in yak, but the data in beef bulls is really clear that the best thing to do in your 50 bull situation is to put one bull in at a time and rotate.
Any other questions for Dr. Anderson before we let everybody get off here? Go ahead.
I want to thank you guys. This has been very informative to me, and this is going to help us with our herd development a lot. So thank you very much.
Got any questions? All you gotta do is call, brother.
Okay, so
Thanks so much,
Hey,
Les.
I don't always answer on the first ring, but I'll eventually get back to you.
okay,
No,
thank you very much.
Thanks, Les and Jeff. Thank
Go
you so
ahead.
much.
Yes, no, thanks everybody for joining us. Dr. Anderson, thanks for sharing with us this evening. And just a reminder, the October 28th, we'll have a conference at Moorhead. And one of the things we'll do there is we'll body condition score, we'll show folks how to put cedars in cows, and some of those concepts that Dr. Anderson covered here this evening. So we'd like to see y'all out there if you can make it. Everybody have a great night.